Hello and welcome to Quarantine or Not to Quarantine? That is the question. This is a podcast recorded in association with the ESRC Social Science Festival. I'm Dr. Ian Channing. I'm a lecturer in the University of Plymouth in criminology, and I'm going to be joined in discussion today talking about the experiences of Plymouth and quarantine with Professor Judith Rowbotham.
Hello, I'm a professor in the law school with a background in history as well as law and criminology.
So in this podcast today, me and Judith are going to discuss some of the issues relating to quarantine and look behind some of the legal issues as well, and look back at some historical experiences of Plymouth and relate them to some of the experiences that we're having today. So the legislation that the government's using today to enforce quarantine and social distancing measures is the Public Health Control of Disease Act 1984. Now, there were global discussions on a unified or global response to contagious diseases. So that started back in the 1960s. And this involved the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and this was intended to update quarantine regulations globally and to have an agreed international strategy. But the UK's response was different to this. And Judith, what was the history of the legal response to quarantine?
Quarantine, in the modern sense, starts back in the 14th century in Venice. Interestingly, you can say that Venice was a port very like Plymouth. It was at the crossroads of local trade, but it was also a major port that took in people and goods at the end of the Silk Road, so coming all the way from China through to the top of India, across what was then Persia and the Ottoman Empire, into the European trading system. And this meant that people, as well as cargoes, were always arriving. It's estimated that the Black Death started actually in Venice. And in reaction, Venice, for the first time, introduced laws which detained ships and the people on the ships for 40 days, 40 days, which is where we get the term quarantine. Gradually, over centuries, other European countries caught on, introduced legislation to detain ships for periods of time, particularly if they were sailing from ports that were associated with outbreaks of the plague. And Britain, England, Wales, Scotland were just about the last places to get on board with quarantine legislation. We don't here introduce quarantine legislation until the 17th century during the Civil War, and Plymouth, as well as London, are some of the first places, the first ports to be affected, once again because of their high international profile.
So is there anything distinctive about Plymouth then in its approach to then how it went about quarantine?
Yes. Initially, the quarantine was just one place. Plymouth Sound was a perfect place for quarantining ships. But with Plymouth Dock, later Devonport, developing as a naval base, what you get is two areas of quarantine. You have the commercial area that was still off the Hoe, but for the naval ships, it was a site that was visible for the Hamos. It was used for the British Royal Navy, but also any visiting naval ships if they were coming from possible infected ports.
So Plymouth and Plymouth Dock, or later Devonport, would have been an incredibly busy port if it was commercial and military.
Plymouth was indeed one of the most significant maritime destinations whether you were in the Navy, so sailing in and out of Plymouth, or whether you were a commercial ship trading in people, passengers, trading in goods. It was the destination, for instance, if you were sailing to the UK from much of Ireland. So there was a local dimension. You had regular traffic between Plymouth and Europe, and of course it was a major destination for ships sailing outside European waters. So your ship might actually start in London, but you'd touch in at Plymouth, and then you would sail off to Africa, to Asia, to North or South America. It is important to remember just how significant a port Plymouth was for trading both within and outside Europe, and indeed around the British Isles.
So with the quarantine measures that they used in the Sounds then, did this help keep Plymouth safe from many epidemics?
Of course it didn't, because the epidemics were arriving through smaller ports with fewer quarantine measures, and to an extent, after the Black Death, plague for instance, was endemic already, and outbreaks of plague were commonplace throughout the Middle Ages and the early modern period. To such an extent was Plymouth one of the areas affected that in the late 16th century, the 1580s, 1590s, and the early 17th century, the first couple of decades of the 1600s, Plymouth actually developed a strategy of using contagion houses. These were houses that the local ratepayers raised a sum of money to be paid to families that were held to be vulnerable to disease, or perhaps they'd been in contact with somebody, perhaps a member of the family had the disease. So if you moved into the contagion house and separated yourself from the community, you would be paid, you would be fed, you would be lodged, just so long as you kept away from the general population. It doesn't seem to have worked particularly well, but it was certainly tried.
So quarantining then was typically onshore for people that had the diseases or the symptoms of the disease.
It wasn't called quarantine, but effectively that's what it was. There was the idea of segregation, of keeping away from other people. So the term quarantine was originally only used for the maritime dimension. Contagion was and contagious houses was the terminology that was preferred for what we would call land-based quarantining.
So then for the people of Plymouth, they would have had very little experience of quarantine, but typically their risk of infection would have been greater than maybe other places that didn't have such an influential port?
Well, yes, because inevitably there were times when diseases did come ashore. Perhaps somebody was carrying the seeds of a disease. So we do know that particularly the Irish, interestingly enough, were associated with bringing smallpox on several occasions to Plymouth in the 18th and early 19th century.
So was there ever a discussion on having larger quarantine measures within the town rather than, in the Sound to try and keep people safe, to try and keep people isolated away from disease?
This developed in Plymouth in the 19th century, as indeed it did across England. And it, as much as anything else, related to the new ideas about disease. Was it caused by contagion, or was it caused by environmental factors, including the quality of water, sewage disposal and things like that? And that was particularly significant in Plymouth because Plymouth was a difficult town to expand geographically because it was bordered by quite a number of large estates. Devonport itself, for instance, was built on land which had been purchased by the Crown from the St Alban family. But you had the Edgcombes, you had the Earls of Morley, all of them with substantial estates, which meant that Plymouth itself and the other of the three towns were very, very crammed. And the level of overcrowding in Plymouth by the mid-19th century was enormous. And as a result, any epidemic disease that started in the overcrowded slums was likely to run rampant, whether it was scarlet fever, typhoid, typhus, smallpox, or the new incomer, cholera.
So what was Plymouth's experience with cholera? Because we know there were different cholera outbreaks throughout the 19th century. So what was Plymouth's experience of cholera?
There was a real attempt to discuss quarantine. The problem was that quarantine was going to be expensive, and there wasn't the will that they'd had at the end of the 16th, the start of the 17th century amongst Plymouth ratepayers to stump up the money to promote a new version of the contagion houses. Plymouth was very, very reluctant to introduce any public health legislation along the nationally recommended lines. It introduced its own much cheaper versions, and it's not until 1848 that it's coerced into adopting the terms of the Public Health Act 1848, which establishes the duty to notify of certain contagious diseases. And it's at that point, internationally, the term quarantine seems to become the common parlance for attempts to segregate parts of a community suffering from one of these notifiable diseases. And the earliest mention I've found of quarantine is actually a scarlet fever epidemic in Plymouth in 1831. But within 20 years, it's the term that seems to be very commonly used. I suppose it makes sense because they were so used to seeing quarantine ships flying the yellow flag to say this was a ship in quarantine.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, to note some of the parallels of the discussions around quarantine, because you mentioned the mid-19th century then, and I think typically by the end of the 19th century, the same sort of narratives around quarantine were still happening. In Plymouth, there was a discussion on cholera again when a ship came in to Plymouth from Calcutta that had reported deaths of cholera on board, and they discussed quarantine then, but they reinstated the point that any sort of quarantine in the town would be an inconvenience to the populace, and they didn't want to inconvenience not just citizens but also commerce as well. And I think some of those discussions are very relevant today as well, aren't they?
Very much so. What you're seeing in the 19th century is very similar because it's a debate between science, the medical officers in the ports, in the town, advocating undertaking the expense of interrupting commerce, interrupting the daily life of the communities in the three towns in order to control a particular notifiable disease, but the local authorities in all of the three towns always showed themselves reluctant to listen to science, preferring the economic urgencies, which is different, I suppose you could say, today, where currently it is the science that is dictating the extent of government strategy, government measures, both nationally and locally, whereas the economic dimension is being much less listened. But at core, it's still very much the same debate. In 19th century Plymouth, you can say that the scientists, the medical sanitary officers, the local officers of health were not the preferred experts. It was both military and commercial practicalities that carried the day.
Another point about Plymouth would be that people disembarking from Plymouth, as it's a major port, would then be going on to the rest of the country, wouldn't they? Many of them disembarking. So what sort of measures were in place then for people that might have been on an infected ship and were then able to come on board and carry on to their place of destination?
Part of the problem was that the legislation dealt only with the permanent crew. It didn't actually deal with passengers. So you could detain the sailors, but it was a matter of voluntary choice for many of the passengers under the legislation that operated until very late in the 19th century, when they do introduce measures that can detain passengers as well. The real problem is that the ships were not set up for an extended stay by the passengers. They were better set up to keep sailors who were anyway better used to poor rations, whereas mutiny amongst passengers could have been expected if they were detained, with something we've seen recently on cruise ships, where good quality food and drink ran out and passengers were not impressed. So, for commercial reasons, the arguments that you shouldn't detain passengers were dominant in the 19th century.
Judith, you mentioned before that spatially Plymouth was restricted in its growth, but at the same time throughout the 19th century the population was growing, so there was much more density of the population within Plymouth. And this is bound to have an effect on any infectious diseases within the three towns. Were the local officials seen as doing a good job by the population of Plymouth at this time?
The local population becomes increasingly unhappy during actual outbreaks. They're not willing to pay beforehand, but the population as a whole, at the time, for instance, of the cholera outbreak in 1848, 1849, is increasingly unhappy with the apparent inability of the local councils in the three towns to deal with the cholera epidemic. What happens in 48-49 is that the bulk of actual daily disease management is undertaken by a bunch of Anglican sisters, a sisterhood established in Devonport by Miss Lydia Sallam. It is Miss Lydia Sallam and her sisters who take on the bulk of the nursing, and there is huge resentment when they are criticised. They were Anglican nuns, sisters, not Catholic ones, but a number of prominent local Plymothians accuse them of using the opportunity to spread Roman Catholicism amongst the staunchly Protestant population in Plymouth. And there is a popular reaction against that in Plymouth itself, because for the level of help they offered, Miss Selland and the sisters became deservedly hugely popular locally. And it certainly saw a real impact on local elections in Plymouth. So they weren't seen as doing a good job. Any emergency does test local resources, and Plymouth, Stonehouse and Devonport were held by the local population, the local ratepayers, in 48-49, not to have done a particularly good job.
I think for any authoritative response, there needs to be a level of legitimacy, Judith, doesn't there? And I think we've seen that with some of the, contemporary experiences of lockdown today. We quite often hear in the media about, the Dominic Cummings. We quite often hear about the Scottish Nationalist Party MP that travelled when she knew she was positive for COVID. And these sorts of experiences creates disharmony amongst the population. And I think a lot of that disharmony will come when people think that they're being treated differently to others or are being denied something that other people are having. So there's an issue of legitimacy with any sort of response that the government initiates. And with lockdown or with any level of quarantine that needs to be applied, there needs to be public consensus with that. And keeping a sense of legitimacy with the government response is really important in keeping public order as well. There's been some work done on causes of disorder. People like Clifford Stott and Stephen Riker, for example, have talked about legitimacy in terms of how disorder can be caused when there's a sense of illegitimacy or grievance that might be denying a group of people something. And with quarantine, we're naturally getting that. We're being, told when we can go and drink or who we can go and visit and so forth. But then also that grievance needs to also relate to an in-group. So there's a heightened sense of grievance when people feel that they're being targeted, but other sections of the community are not. And I think that's really important with any sort of quarantine response when people feel that they may be more hard done by than other people. And thirdly, there needs to be an outgroup. So someone that can be a target of people's frustration. So when people have a grievance, who are they going to attack? And quite often the government or the police might be seen as an authority where they become the target of that grievance. So in enforcing a quarantine legislation, there's also an aspect of it that you need to be able to control public order as well. We can see some of the dissatisfaction today from the public about the inconsistencies with some of the government responses through the debate around the North and South divide. We can see dissatisfaction through social media, but also through some of the more prominent protests around the country. There's been several at Trafalgar Square, for example, in London. But we can also see inconsistencies in some of the history as well in relation to quarantine. If we go back to 1919, a steamship came into Plymouth that had several cases of smallpox on board. And the civilian population in this case were allowed to proceed to their destination. However, on board were also 1,400 soldiers who were expected to be demobbed and returned to their homes. But words got out that they were actually going to be moved to a barracks and quarantined for a period of time. And the newspaper report highlighted their grievance as they said that as the civilian population were not put in quarantine, then they did not intend to be either. So through this inconsistency, through this idea that an in-group was being had an unfair grievance against the authorities when other people were allowed to proceed to their destinations, there was a lot of dissatisfaction amongst these to be demobbed soldiers. And the authorities then feared disorder, let alone potential mutiny. So they then reversed their decision to quarantine the troops. And that was a decision that was met with heartily cheers. So there's an important point here about procedural fairness. And that leads us on to discussions around the different group dynamics within society, especially in a time of crisis. And we've seen recently how the Chinese population have become increasingly vulnerable to hate crimes. Even in Plymouth, several cases have been reported where one Chinese student was unable to go into or was refused entry into a restaurant. And also social media hate campaigns being launched against people of South Asian origin as well. So in consideration of the experiences of the Chinese population in Plymouth. Are there any historical parallels, Judith, from epidemics from the past in Plymouth?
There most certainly are. It was the Irish who were blamed, for instance, for the cholera epidemics. And if you were Irish in Plymouth in the 1830s and 1840s, you were quite likely to find yourself in need of rescuing by the police from various attacks launched on you, blaming the Irish community. This was something that wasn't just within the slum community itself. If you look at the minutes of the various Plymouth council committees, the Irish come out time and again as being potentially the reasons why Plymouth was experiencing a particular epidemic. The outside commentators felt that this was very unfair, but Plymouth itself was not prepared to listen. It didn't like the Irish, and they were therefore the useful and the convenient targets, particularly because a lot of them were so easily identifiable through their distinctive accents. I think one of the things that this manifestation of hate crime, both past and present, reveals is a level of consent to quarantine laws, that the regulations, be they local bylaws or national legislation, are held to be useful. You can blame somebody for a group of people for creating the need for them, but it does show a level of consensus. It's when that consensus breaks down, when the debate begins to change, as we are seeing now, that the problems with quarantine regulation, historically and currently, begin to become significant.
By and large, I think there was consent back in March when we went into the first national lockdown. I think there was this sense that we were all in this together. So when we get some of the instances that challenge this narrative of this, we can see how quickly things can change. I mean, in Plymouth, we had a case, didn't we, where the nuclear-powered HMS Trenchant, who allowed a party at Devonport Dockyard in Plymouth during the national lockdown, received a lot of negative publicity. Because the crew had been working close together on board for so long, there was little chance that they were putting each other at risk of infection. But what this party did do was to give this sense that we weren't all in this together and exceptions were being made for certain people, Judith.
Yes, and that, I think, is the issue with quarantine. If quarantine is to work, if it is to be supported, it has to be seen as not just being a reasonable response, scientifically, socially, economically, to a particular threat from an epidemic disease, but it needs to be something where there is a sense that we're all in it together. So you can draw a parallel between the outraged reaction to somebody in a position of national authority and visibility like Dominic Cummings, as mentioned at the beginning, but also this apparently small local incident in Devonport, because it was seen, it was shared on the social media. Had it remained private, no doubt they could have got away with it. It's because it became public knowledge that it was necessary for the authorities to take action if they were to be able to continue to claim we're all in it together. So quarantine is apparently legally clear, but as with any legislation, it's always open to interpretation. and it always needs consensus and popular consent.
At the time of recording this, we are currently facing further restrictions in the future, Judith, aren't we? So I think, it's a good time for us to stop and reflect on the history and also to think about our current situation. But we're not out of this yet.
We're not out of this yet, and we expect that this will be the first of a series of at least another one podcasts on Plymouth and the lockdown.
Okay, thank you, Professor Judith Rowbotham, for joining me today for this discussion.